Hi, it's Ken. Welcome to this week's video, in the Frequently Asked Spiritual Questions series. Today, I'm going to address questions about confusion around consciousness, and I feel like this is maybe the beginning of a series of questions. The questions around consciousness, I'm realizing, are just too big to address in any single video. So today, I'm going to explore victim consciousness with you and dive into it at a deeper level, but I want to hold it to three kind of core themes, which we'll get into here in just a moment. If this is your first time on my channel here, I invite you to subscribe if you haven't already, and please do click the bell to be notified. And if this video resonates with you, I invite you to give it a thumbs up. And I want to welcome everyone who's participating in the live stream live, as well as everyone who is tuning in to the replay. I welcome your comments and questions during either the live stream. You can comment on the live stream on YouTube and on my professional Facebook page, and I will see those comments and I'll be able to interact with you. And on the replay, I'll be tuning in to the various places this is being replayed. And I should mention, on live interactions through Twitter, I can also see your comments there. Okay, let's get started on this confusion around consciousness, and in particular with victim consciousness, which seems to be enlivened for a lot of people right now. And I want to jump right in here. Let's make that bigger. So the confusion around consciousness, I think, begins with actually what is consciousness? Consciousness is the lens through which we interpret and interact with the world. Consciousness does not establish the raw facts. The raw facts are the raw facts. Reality is reality. Consciousness is how we interact and interpret with them. And I want to do a quick drawing here to illustrate this. And it's a very simple drawing. But if we imagine that this circle right here is an orange, if we look at it, actually, let's leave it as a two-dimensional object first to illustrate one thing. If we look at it from this angle over here, if we're above the circle and off to the side, it actually appears, whoops, that's not a very, there it is. Hallelujah, the drawing program rendered it. It actually looks like this, right? And if we look at it from the top, it looks like this. And we could actually exaggerate it too. I suppose there are some, and I may actually have my perspective wrong, but there are some angles from which it would look like this, aren't there? And if we were looking at this same thing from all these different perspectives, we could very quickly get into an argument about which interpretation is correct. And without some sort of naming convention for understanding the perspectives from which we're looking at this circle on the page, we could get into a finger pointing shot. How can you possibly say that's an oval? It's not an oval. It's obviously a circle, and so on. You get the point. Okay, so victim consciousness is primarily identified with the disempowered, separate self. So what does it mean to be identified with disempowerment? I think we all have this experience, but let's just define our terms for just a moment here. Disempowered, meaning if I'm in victim consciousness right now, I'm feeling like I have no efficacy, no power in my life. I feel like other people, circumstances, situations, etc., have the power, have the ability to influence what's happening for me, but I don't have the ability to influence what's happening for me. And separate, as in separate from myself, separate from God, and separate from others. So it's a profoundly disconnected state. And self just meaning it's the lens through which I perceive this. And I don't want to sit here and try to tell you that the disempowered separate self isn't real. In fact, I want to do the opposite. I want to say that the disempowered separate self is absolutely real. It is a real stage of consciousness. And from my standpoint, it's a developmental stage of consciousness, which we can talk more about if you have questions about that. What I mean by developmental is it is part of the development of becoming aware of the perceptual lens, or opening into perceiving and interacting with the world as it actually is. From the disempowered separate self, we're perceiving the world from a place that is profoundly disempowered and separate, disconnected from self, divine, and others. Okay, so that all makes sense, right? So let's talk about controlling consciousness. And let me just put the screen back up here. Controlling consciousness, or another name that I have for this, is manifestor consciousness. This is STOR. Let me just clean this up. Manifestor, there's the I. Manifestor consciousness is the empowered separate self. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the empowered separate self, controlling consciousness, when talking about victim consciousness and the disempowered separate self, is that the contrast from these two perceptual lenses is very, very different. And we're going to dive into that more in a moment. But just to be clear, what do I mean by empowered? I mean, this is from the perspective of one way of calling this is personal power. Or we could also say having absolute control. And this is a really, really profound state of existence. But again, it's separate from self, separate from God or the divine. And this is an I, not an O, and separate from others. Now, in victim consciousness, I'm going to just use, I'll just say victim, okay? And then we'll say in control. In victim consciousness, the experience that one has in victim consciousness is things are happening like this. And then the circle is your experience or my experience, right? In controlling consciousness, we're having this experience. But there's a huge difference here. And you might think that these are the same, but they're not. As in, this is just the opposite of this, but that's not true. These are not two-way processes. It's not, if not this one, then it's this one. That's not true. In this dynamic, in victim consciousness, this dynamic involves others. And here, it just involves you. It's just about you, in other words. Victim consciousness is all about other people, other groups of individuals, situations, and so on. Controlling consciousness is all about you. It's your perceptual lens. That's the key. When you move into controlling consciousness, you're saying, I am responsible for my experience. And the most foundational point of responsibility is how I am interpreting what is going on. Here's another way of saying this. Let's say I've often used this example in this series of videos, and I'll link to some others so you can see if you'd like to dive into this deeper. But I've often said that the experience in victim consciousness is about what is happening out here. In other words, I'm either in choppy water or smooth water in my life. And I've said it has to do with thinking. But the thing is that thinking in and of itself is not victim consciousness. It's that in victim consciousness, we are primarily identified with our disempowered thoughts. This is a huge point of clarity. and one that has been clear for me for a long, long time, but I'm not sure that I've said it this clearly ever before. And I actually had some comments over the last couple of days in social media that seemed to indicate that someone who has done a lot of studying with me over the years was thinking that all examples of thinking were examples of victim consciousness. Not true. The thinking faculty in and of itself is not predicated to any particular stage of consciousness. And not being in victim consciousness does not mean that you're not thinking. Oops, I forgot to turn off the speaker on my computer here. Apologize for the background noise. What I mean is that in victim consciousness, here's another way that I've described victim consciousness. We're primarily identified with our thoughts. Okay, but the question is, primarily identified with the thoughts of what? Of the disempowered, separate self. That's key. The lead energy. Here's another way I've described it. An inverted triangle. The least energy is around being, and a little bit more energy is around feeling, but the bulk of the energy is around thinking. But that does not mean that thoughts are victim consciousness. It means we're embodied in our heads. Two totally different things, okay? All right. So I want to say this again, okay? Because this is so important. Consciousness does not equal facts. All that consciousness does equal is an interpretation of the facts. That's it. This is huge, okay? Here's another thing that's really big to say. Oops. Victim consciousness is not the same thing as, being victimized. They're not the same, okay? Being victimized is something that happens in every stage of consciousness, not just in victim consciousness. One person emailed in and said, oops, I'm pressing the wrong button. I want to set aside there we go. Set aside the drawing for just a minute. One person wrote in and said, okay, I'm confused because people are being victimized all the time. And there was a question about the Holocaust. Can you explain to me how the Holocaust happened in anything other than in victim consciousness? The fact of the Holocaust, the fact of 11 plus million people being murdered, the fact of 6 million plus Jews being murdered in conjunction with the Holocaust is different than victim consciousness. All those people and their loved ones and so on were victimized by that dynamic. That's a fact. Victim consciousness is very, very different than that. Let's not use the Holocaust as an example for this because it might be easier and a little more accessible. Someone says, obviously. Okay, but that may be obvious to both of us. But I don't think this is obvious to everyone. And that's why I'm trying to say this, okay? Getting clear about the baseline in consciousness is so, so important, okay? And here's why. When I move from an experience of being victimized to primarily identified in my disempowered separate self, now I'm interpreting everything through the lens of being a victim. Right? Whereas if I am in my empowered separate self, in controlling or manifestor consciousness, I'm identified with my empowered separate self and I'm interpreting everything through that lens. So, for example, let's say somebody is victimized. Something bad happens. Someone, I don't know, let's use something low key. What's a low-key example? Okay, listen, my identity was stolen recently. Someone got a hold of my social security number, my date of birth, and so on, my address and all of that. Okay, so that is an experience of being victimized, right? And so if I were identified in my disempowered separate self, I would be saying, oh my gosh, this is just another example in a long line of how I have absolutely no power in my life. All these things are just happening to me. And if I were in my empowered separate self, I would be interpreting that and saying, what did I do to attract this? In other words, excuse me, I am the author of my life. Now, there's another stage of consciousness, there's another interpretation as well. Okay, and we'll go into that another week, or we could dive in further if you have questions about this. But I want to be clear about this. Being victimized is a fact. The experience of being victimized happens. The fact of that does not mean that one is in victim consciousness. Okay, two different things. Okay, someone suggested being robbed. Great. It's another example. If you're robbed, you could have an experience of being robbed. Someone might they might steal your purse or your wallet. We call it getting mugged in the United States. I'm sure there are other cultures that refer to it in the same way for our viewers around the world. And when you're mugged, you could say, oh my gosh, you know, here's this story. Let me tell you, this has been going on for decades. Dot, 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 dot. There's victim consciousness or controlling consciousness. What have I done to attract this into my dynamic? Let me just give you a preview of conduit consciousness. Someone in conduit consciousness isn't having an experience anymore of things that are controllable by me or not controllable by me. That is to say, what have I done to create this dynamic? They're not having an experience of everything as a dynamic of being victimized. They're having an experience of everything is divine. Everything is an expression of divinity. And the divine is the unknown divine, right? So maybe the person in conduit consciousness says, well, that person must have needed my money more than I did. But they might also say, I don't understand why this happened, but I know that everything is of God. Everything is of the divine. Everything is held in the divine field. There is nothing outside of the divine or beyond the divine. So they don't see the person who robbed them as an expression of evil or anything like that. That's not where they're coming from. They're coming from everything is an expression of divinity. We could take this even a step further if it's helpful for you. The person in conduit consciousness recognizes that the source of pain and suffering is the illusion of separation. And so they might be saying, that person must be in a profound bit of pain from the illusion of separation, however they're encountering it, such that that pain is driving them to this behavior. And we could substitute that in for any example where being victimized is on the table. Literally any example. Okay, let's go back now to the third major point here. Let me see if I can flip over to another screen. Okay, so in victim consciousness, the goal is safety. So the interpretation yeah, somebody on Twitter doesn't like this. This is really important, okay? Somebody on Twitter is saying, I don't know what the username is, or I mean, I can see it, but I don't know how to say it. Somebody says, I knew you were headed for the divine, and they're saying, nope, okay? They don't agree. But here's the thing, okay? And I recognize that what I'm talking about may be a perceptual lens that is inaccessible for you right now. And I'm not saying that to you like, there, you poor thing, you're incapable of viewing the world this way. I'm saying to you, in the developmental journey, once this is integrated enough, you will experience these other stages of consciousness. And if right now you're primarily identified in your disempowered separate self, Your experience of what is unfolding in your life is all happening through victim consciousness. Period. End of story. There is no other interpretation available. And in the context of the disempowered separate self, everything is about good and evil. And the question is, how do I develop psychological safety? How do I develop physical safety? How do I develop spiritual safety? And the answers to those questions in victim consciousness are radically different than they are in the other stages of consciousness. In fact, we can get into a dynamic of denial, of subscription to things that are simply not related to actual facts. And I'll illustrate this for you related to the current pandemic. Okay, what's going on with coronavirus? If somebody's watching this some years hence and you don't know what I'm talking about, hard to imagine, but let's just say that's possible. Okay, so I'm talking about coronavirus when I say this. So let's give 4 examples of how somebody might interpret. And obviously there are thousands or millions or billions of responses to the coronavirus pandemic, but I just wanted to distill them down for a simple example. Okay, so we have scientific facts, which for some people apparently are not accepted or we can debate them, but still there are actual facts, and I'll put some links in the video here to a New York Times article that's, I think, perfectly reasonable, neutral resource that most people would recognize as a reasonable source for facts. So there's a blog actually by a biologist, I believe, who has been talking about what are the characteristics associated with the coronavirus. Okay, so somebody who is feeling disempowered and separate from the divine might respond to that by seeking safety, by following the prescription for how to be safe right now, to isolate, to wear a mask, and I recognize wearing a mask for some people is this hugely contentious issue, but that just illustrates my point. So stick with me here. If I'm pushing your buttons, it's okay. It's okay. We don't all have to agree on this. I'm trying to explain why we don't agree, why there are these huge factions of disagreement and tension between people who otherwise were perceiving the world in very similar ways. And all of a sudden there's this huge fracture. These massively different expressions of reality are going on. And it's not the actual reality is different. It's the interpretation of the reality. Okay, so lots of people have this rational response to not feeling safe. They follow the scientific prescription for being safe. They wash their hands a lot. They wear a mask in public. They wear protective gear and so on. And one of the examples that we can see of this is that people who are treating others who are ill are doing that to protect themselves. And I can show you an example actually of somebody who is, or a group of people who are saying one thing about the virus, but behaving in another way. Their behavior and what they're saying are incongruent because they represent a split between the motivation or what's going on. Both are happening in this victim consciousness dynamic. Again, wearing a mask does not make you a victim. I'm saying it's happening in the context of being safe. Okay. So, all right. So what's another interpretation? Another interpretation might be, well, I've been hanging out with my empowered separate self, and the virus has come along and it has made me feel disempowered. And I don't like feeling disempowered. And I'm asking the question, what have I done to attract this into my life? And I think about it, and maybe I come up with an answer. And so then I clear the thing that I think was in the way, but still I'm afraid. And so I don't know how to resolve that feeling of being disempowered. And one of the ways to resolve that feeling psychologically is to now begin subscribing to a scenario whereby there is an evil energy or a presence, an organized effort for this to disrupt things. And then that lets me off the hook, right? There's a conspiracy. It's the plandemic concept, and there are many different expressions of this. And this entire approach completely ignores scientific evidence of the facts, but it makes sense in the context, for some people, in the context of victim consciousness, because they're trying to figure out how to feel safe. Okay, and look, we can think of other examples of this, right? It's not just around the pandemic. There are plenty of people in the world who deny that the Holocaust ever happened. Why would they deny something that is actually part of history ever happened? Because in their disempowered separate self, it leads them to feel a greater degree of safety. And there are lots of other behaviors that can go on here. We can deny that the pandemic is real. We can refer to it as a hoax. In the United States, our president did exactly that. But in recent days, when the coronavirus has begun to show up as a hotspot in the White House, what are they actually doing? They're responding to it not by continuing to call it a hoax, but by following scientific protocol. All of this is happening in the context of feeling disempowered. Does that make sense? It is, and I recognize that there are some limitations to the language, the way the language is, the way that I'm utilizing these words to describe this has in and of itself a limitation. But the problem is there's no way around this limitation. The limitation is that language itself is born in separation. And so anything we talk about is fundamentally being discussed in separation. But we can still point to the underlying energy, the underlying lens, the consciousness through which we're interpreting these things. And that can make all the difference in the world, not just in understanding our own response, but also in understanding other people's responses. Remember, in victim consciousness, fundamentally, there's good and evil. Now, I want to do something else here before we wrap up. I want to try to explain. Let me just look at my notes here and make sure that I'm on track for the things that I wanted to cover for today. This will help make the video more effective. Yeah, there's another response too, right? In the disempowered separate self, there's an experience of saying, God will protect me, right? This is a really interesting dynamic that happens because, of course, in all stages of consciousness is the divine, right? Or the absence of the divine. That would be an expression of what's referred to as evil. So in an experience in victim consciousness, there are rules for how to interact with God, what we have to do to fundamentally find God's favor, because God is separate from us. If God were fundamentally integrated and part of our experience in victim consciousness, we wouldn't be in separation anymore. We might be having an experience of our disempowered selves. We might be having an experience of being victimized, but we would not be having an experience of separation from the divine. So in separation from the divine, one interpretation is God is punishing us, right? Or another is that there is this evil expression, this dark energy that we have to protect ourselves from. And notice the role that dark energy plays in a lot of the conspiracies. That is a dark energy that is going to consume. And so we need to be protected. Do you see? We need to have safety. What's really interesting to me is that a number of people that I would consider my peers have started sharing information in social media and in other forms that are talking about, you have to be on the right side of history if you don't call this out right now. And what they're doing is they're pointing towards all these conspiracies. What it's really doing is, from my perspective, is it illuminates the consciousness that is being triggered within the individual. It's not a reflection of what's happening in the actually real level of reality. But I want to show you something that might confuse things a little bit, but it might also clarify for those that are able to see this. So here we have an individual who has phenomenal psychic abilities. And let's just say, just for the sake of argument, that psychic skills are actually and abilities are something that are actually real on the order of facts as I presented them at the beginning. Okay. But look at this. If we, I've drawn a person, but I haven't put this up on the screen. So here it is. So look at this. We have somebody who has these incredible gifts, and these gifts can express in their thinking. But when they're embodied here, when this is where they feel resonance or dissonance, more likely, their thinking is from their disempowered separate self. That is to say, the lens, the glasses through which they're perceiving that experience is through disempowerment. So what they're seeing intuitively, which they experience as absolutely real, is the manifestation of good and evil. These things are light and these things are dark. And more likely in their disempowered separate self, it's not about these things are light. It's I see this dark truth expressing, and we have to get the word out so that we can be safe. Knowledge, thinking is the way out of it, right? Thinking according to this disempowered separate self perspective. And if we're embodied in our hearts, that is to say, in controlling consciousness, in feeling, now we're having an identification with our empowered separate selves. And that's very different. You want to hear what that sounds like? That sounds like we need to get clear about the reality that is opening up as a result of this pandemic, so that we can bring into reality our vision for what we are really capable of being. And sometimes these two things are mixed together. The reason we need to dream up what we really are opening to in this opportunity is because of now shifting into disempowerment, because of all this dark energy that I see related to conspiracy, conspiracy, conspiracy. And even if we just say for a moment that this is coming from somebody who sees things as they actually are, the lens, I'm trying to do this without knocking the microphone, the lens through which they're receiving that intuitive information, in simple language, is ungrounded. But in the context of an embodiment or consciousness perspective, I'm pointing down to the iPad here that I'm drawing on, is in the disempowered separate self. So what they see is all this darkness, all this scary, evil expression of horrificness that, and I'm even willing to concede, as if this is up to me to do, but I'm willing to concede for the sake of our discussion and even for the sake of actual reality that they are perceiving what is really real. Yet they are perceiving it through the disempowered separate self. And the people who are focused on dreaming reality into expression, into existence, are in their empowered separate self. But if we're down here in an experience of being, we are identified with our whole self. And this is a function of an experience. The origin of this, of being, is coming not from thinking, not from feeling, but from being and experiential. And that doesn't mean we don't have feelings that are associated with that or thoughts that are associated with that. We're still thinking in, this is conduit consciousness here, by the way. Let's see, conduit here. This is, and I'm drawing it at this level because it's at the level of hips. That's at the level that it's embodied at. So hopefully I've begun to clarify a little bit around the confusion related to consciousness, and in particular, victim consciousness. I've heard some people actually deny scientific knowledge and say science is limited to victim consciousness. This is a misunderstanding of consciousness. Consciousness is not the facts. It's the interpretation of the facts. And for many, many people who right now are being identified with their disempowered separate self because of the fear that is getting triggered right now because of the coronavirus, this response of creating psychological safety by denying scientific facts is understandable in consciousness, but it doesn't actually relate to what is actually real. And in this case, there's a really huge danger as a result of this. And it's not just a danger to the individual who is feeling that way, is it? Because one individual's behavior can place other people at risk. It can put other people's health and well-being at risk, can't it? Okay. I was trying to explain about the role of organized religion in victim consciousness, and let me just check the comments here and see if there's anyone who's wanting to dive deeper into that right now. We can certainly address that in a future frequently asked questions video on a future Monday. Oh, Gary's checking in. Great to be here with you. Yeah, wonderful. And on Twitter. That's beautiful. Great, Gary. Thanks for checking in and letting me know. Okay, so the thing I want to say to you about this, from a quick summary, is just remember, consciousness, our consciousness, your consciousness is the lens through which you interpret the facts. And that consciousness may include a instinct, an urge to deny facts. It could happen to any of us, right? I'm not a psychologist, so I can't describe the psychological dynamic, but I'm confident that we could have a psychologist on who explains that. It'd be really easy to Google that and understand it, okay? But I just want to say this, for the sake of safety, it's easy to get into the dynamic of denial, but that is a lens through which we interpret reality. It's not what's actually real. It's the lens. And everything that we're interpreting in victim consciousness is a lens. And so you might say to me, well, Ken, you've just said to us, scientific knowledge is an expression of something that is actually real in victim consciousness. If I've said that, I've misspoken. Here's what I'm trying to say. Scientific knowledge exists in every stage of consciousness, but the disempowered separate self only exists in victim consciousness. So there's a huge difference between that. Mike Rad is saying, there is only one consciousness. No? It's a great question, Mike, but here's the thing. If we come to what is actually real, that is to say that we are all undistorted, in my language, undistorted expressions and extensions of the divine. Yes, there is only one consciousness. There is only union consciousness. But the problem with saying there is only one consciousness is, how are we to understand this journey that we take in our lives? A journey that I will grant you is taken in separation. That is to say, at some point in our lives, we begin experiencing ourselves as separate from God. When we're born, we're all born into God consciousness. Oh, well, that's SC, consciousness. And this is the experience of what's actually real. That is to say, everything is divine. The divine and I have this intimate relationship. Think about being around a young child who is just full of extraordinary wisdom, no matter what's going on in life. And the wisdom does not match their years or months, although probably most of us aren't hearing what a several-month-old. But once a child develops language at 1 or 2 years old, and then for a number of years, there's that phenomenal innocence that's going on. And then we experience victim consciousness. And victim consciousness has as its origin, Mike, an experience of being victimized, which is inevitable for a young person. At some point, enough of those happen that bond, that experience of what's actually real, begins to shift. And it shifts into a place of being, as I've been describing, identified with the disempowered separate self. And at some point, possibly, it's not necessary. Some people make this transition in, whenever they're 8, 9, 10 years old, 11 years old, and then they stay in it until they die. And maybe they're dying in their 80s or 90s or something. They've been in victim consciousness their entire lives. But for many people, there's a movement here into controlling consciousness, which I also refer to as manifestor consciousness. And this transition is all about responsibility. right here. And the person who moves from victim consciousness to controlling consciousness is saying, I actually am responsible for this experience. I'm the one who is creating the interpretation. And this is another huge thing. How do you know if it's in victim consciousness? Remember, I drew the picture of the circle everything's happening in. So if we're trying to reach out and affect other people or control other people or interact with other people, that's all happening in victim consciousness. Once we move into controlling consciousness here, it's all about how am I interpreting what's happening to me? And yes, that consciousness ultimately changes the way I perceive what's going on. But you'll notice somebody who makes the transition from victim to controlling consciousness initially, nothing has changed in their world. They might still be on the verge of homelessness or homeless. Maybe they're stricken with cancer. Maybe they're sick with coronavirus. Maybe they're right. All these things, nothing has changed. But then they begin to realize it's how I'm interpreting this. And then comes the empowered separate self. I can create my reality. And there's lots of metaphysics to demonstrate that this is actually real, right? And this is amazing. And then eventually at some point, and we all go here, whether it's on our deathbed or before, we all go into conduit consciousness. And this involves, this transition is all about surrender. And it's surrender to the divine. This bothered somebody on Twitter earlier. No, everything is not the divine. Listen, if everything isn't divine, we're back into victim consciousness. Then we've got good and evil. Some things are beyond the divine and so on. I shared in my book, which is not yet published, but wrote about this actually in my personal Facebook feed Friday or Saturday over the weekend about how the illusion of separation is a gift from God. And I've thought about this and explored it, prayed, worked on inner work, witnessed, worked with people on and on for more than 10 years now. And I can't come to any other conclusion than the illusion of separation is the greatest gift that God has given us. If everything is divine, yes, we have the illusion of separation. It's all happening in these stages of consciousness. It begins to melt away when we move here. In any case, when we surrender to the divine, which is a difficult move for a lot of people while they're still in the body. But after you take your last breath, doesn't matter how empowered the separate self is. Last breath, at some point, the empowered separate self is going, I'm not in charge here anymore. And if we look at near-death experience literature, we see an extraordinary similarity across the board, a diversity of experiences there, but all of which are taking place beyond what that individual was previously capable of perceiving. This stage of consciousness control is all about the imagination, the ability to affect one's empowered dreams, and so on. Here in conduit consciousness, it is the divine moving through me. The divine moving through everyone and everything. This is the thing that upset the individual on Twitter. No, that experience of the virus is not of the divine. That actually, how could it be other than that? It's not that, but arguing about that isn't actually that interesting. The question is, in what stage of consciousness am I experiencing it? It's not even that interesting, right? The bigger question is, what stage of consciousness are you engaging in it? Are you experiencing it? And is it serving you? I mean, effectively, victim consciousness is creating a profound experience of pain and suffering on an extraordinary level, but it serves until it doesn't serve anymore. So it's not like I'm here trying to say to you, you need to be done with victim consciousness. You'll be done with it when you're good and ready to be done with it. And when you are, you'll move into an empowered state. And that's essential. And you'll be in that until you're good and ready to be done with it. And then you'll move into an a surrendered state of conduit consciousness. And then, Mike, you're referring to one consciousness. This is union. And union is now the experience of the totality. But in union, separation is gone. It's a completely different experience. The only way truly to talk about union consciousness is in parable or metaphor or allegory. Now, yeah, this is something Angelica is asking this question. This is a really important question to clarify. Hi, wearing a mask puts me into victim consciousness. What about controlling consciousness, controlling my environment? I'm not saying that wearing a mask puts you in victim consciousness at all. Not at all. The scientific fact is that if you wear a mask, it's actually a way of honoring and protecting others from potential infection from you, unless it's a medical grade mask, in which case it protects you from infection from others. And at least in the United States, certainly in the state of Colorado, there's still a rather limited supply of personal protective equipment, including medical grade protective masks. And I think that's probably true largely in the United States as well, and maybe around the world. In any case, in the United States, we've been asked to, and in certain states mandated to wear cloth masks. It's a way of protecting others, though. And no, it doesn't put us in victim consciousness. I'm just saying that if my empowered separate self were triggered by the coronavirus, one possible response to that is to, well, not one possible response, the response of victim consciousness is to seek safety. And one way of seeking safety would be to wear a mask or to wash your hands or to isolate. And I mean, it's called social isolation, but it really is better referenced, let's say, as physical isolation, or keeping, it's social distance is what they're saying. It's more physical distance than social. We can still communicate with each other. We just aren't supposed to be close to one another unless we're in the same household. So this is huge, right? This is a huge point of clarification, Angelica. Wearing a mask does not, oh, I was going to draw a picture. Mask, not a picture, does not equal victim consciousness. It's simply a way of responding to the fear that comes up from feeling disempowered and separate. And one possible response is to respond to the actual facts and do things that create physical safety. And some of the things that some people think create physical safety really are more about psychological safety or a sense of spiritual safety. For example, some of the churches in the United States continued to hold church under the presumption that they were creating spiritual safety for members of their congregation. And then those congregations became hotspots for the virus because huge groups of people came together and started spreading the virus. I'm not laughing at the occasion of that. I shouldn't even be laughing. It's my response sometimes to the discomfort of separation. It's like I'm laughing at myself, but it shows up when I'm teaching like it just did now. And it's not a good habit of mine. So I'm going to see if I can't work on breaking that. What I'm reflecting when I'm laughing about that is not what happened to those people or the beliefs that brought them together. That's not what I'm saying. The laughter is about my own discomfort with the ways that my unintegrated separate self shows up and expresses. It's a way that I identify with that. And it's an internal turn, and it's a lack of refinement on my part. And I apologize for it. I don't mean to laugh at that. There's nothing funny about that. It's very, very sad. People end up losing their lives because they're doing something that they think will be fulfilling for them spiritually, but places them at physical risk. And in the same way, that attraction to, I'm just calling them conspiracy theories, right? And there are movies now that are making the rounds in social media and so on. It's understandable if we begin to really understand victim consciousness. And that is to say, this disempowered dynamic versus the empowered dynamic. Okay, Mike is saying this is great. I love it. Conduit consciousness is what I love. Yes, conduit consciousness is really, really a profound stage of consciousness. And the thing we have to realize, though, is that we actually have to do the work associated with integrating to come into a state of conduit consciousness. Conduit consciousness is not a mental template. A mental template would be something that is coming either from victim consciousness or from controlling consciousness. There's no way in victim consciousness to say, well, you can do this, but it's not embodied, right? I got to get a drink of water here before. I probably should take a deep breath too, since I'm getting so excited about this opportunity to share this with you. I'm going to mute the button here for just a moment. Excuse me. anytime I'm working, I just consume an enormous amount of water. And you may find too, especially in the Wednesday broadcast, when we're actually going into transmission together, that you get really thirsty. And it's because we're doing a lot of deep spiritual work. We're doing that here as well, but I'm not formally opening into transmission. I'm just sharing with words. So, I was talking about the developmental journey in consciousness. The point is, you can't take a template. You can attempt to do this, right? But it's not embodied. In victim consciousness, so fear, feeling separate, disempowered, separate from the divine, separate from self. You can't say, you can do this, but notice what happens. If you say, now, what would somebody in conduit, what would I do in conduit consciousness? I was in conduit consciousness just 10 seconds ago. And then I got this alert that came through on my cell phone. Things are about to be locked down, or I saw the latest news, or I saw an article that said that deaths are being way exaggerated. And I thought, yeah, they are. This isn't real. And I recognize, oops, I'm going to my disempowered separate self. I want to be identified with my whole self. What's real? What's real? You can't think your way there. It's a being state. It's not a being state that originates from thinking. And if you think about this or reflect on this, consider this from the perspective of mindfulness. This is illustrated in mindfulness. There are initially the exercises in mindfulness are, I am not the feeling and I am not the thinking, right? In other words, I'm not my disempowered separate self and I'm not my empowered separate self. The challenge sometimes for somebody in a mindfulness practice is, how do I move into a being state? And on Wednesday's broadcast, I'm going to do that by doing a chakra tuning exercise. Well, we'll tune from the 7th down to the 1st. So we're going to descend from a disembodied state, which is, it's not that I'm going to disembody you. We're all in some state of disembodiment, likely. And if you're not, no worries. This will just support you in more fully embodying your soul. We're going to descend from a thinking primarily state, that is to say, finding resonance with disempowerment, into a thinking and feeling state, much more empowered, but not from a mental or even an empowerment standpoint. We're not going to be talking about it. It's going to be an energetic or spiritual process. And then we're going to descend into an experience of being. And we're going to do it quickly. It's going to be very straightforward. And you will feel the shift. And I'm going to suggest to you, like if you're saying to me, okay, oh, fine and well, Ken, you're telling me that thoughts continue to happen in all stages of consciousness. Rational thinking goes on in all stages of consciousness. Facts are facts and they're available in all stages of consciousness. Consciousness is just how we interpret that. Okay, fine, great. I believe you. It's great. Now, how do I go from having all this be triggered by the pandemic to an experience beyond my empowerment to actually an experience of the peace? I just caught myself. I've been saying to what is actually real. But the challenge with that statement is, if you ask somebody in victim consciousness what is actually real, they'll tell you, this is real, whatever their lens is. This is real. This conspiracy is real, etc. So I'm going to stop saying what's actually real. I'm going to say an experience to your being presence, which is a phenomenally different perspective to approach anything, including how to be safe. Because in the being presence of the embodied divine, it's not a question of what I do. I am already being it, and I can feel it. I feel it most essentially in my being, and then I feel it in my heart. And if I stay there for a while and do it on a regular basis as part of my spiritual practice, actually my thoughts begin reflecting that as well. And something really powerful changes. Yeah, Gary is saying in Ho'oponopono, Dr. Len would say, you have control over you, so you ask yourself, what is it in me that is causing this? Yes, exactly. And that you can only clean yourself and everything starts to change. How does that fit within your process? So this is really interesting. Ho'oponopono is a way of taking profound responsibility for what is going on, right? And what's interesting is Ho'oponopono, it bridges the gap between controlling consciousness, What can I do to an experience of conduit consciousness, right? So let's do the thing. Gary's saying, Dr. Len is saying, you ask yourself, what is it in me that is causing whatever the situation is? Yes, and then there are 4 steps, right? You apologize. I'm sorry. Please forgive me, right? Is the second step. Thank you. And I love you. Now, the thing is, you could argue that some of this is happening in controlling consciousness, and certainly initiating that is coming from a place of control, right? What in me is causing this? But notice how the minute you start apologizing, who is apologizing for what? Who is saying what? I'm sorry. There's the separate self. Please forgive me. Separate self. Thank you is a whole self, right? I think, or it's getting there. It's in the movement into wholeness. And I love you. Well, there are lots of different experiences of love, right? Love could be, I love you despite your flaws, right? Or there's just, I love you. And at some point, I'm guessing for the Ho'oponopono practitioner, and I'd love to hear from you, Gary, to see if you think this resonates. At some point, the love that you begin expressing when you say, I love you, is love that has as its origin beyond the separate self. It's an experience of the whole self. It's an experience of one's divinity. So in some way, we have transitioned from a controlling dynamic to a surrender dynamic, and something profoundly different is beginning to happen. It's really beautiful. And here's the other thing. When things show up and the instinct is to respond and control, the answer isn't, well, how can I get back into conduit? It's how can I be embodied in where I am and respond that this be integrated? And Ho'oponopono is a really profound practice in controlling consciousness. It's a beautiful way of opening up to what is actually real. Let me say this differently, into what is a natural byproduct of the being presence of the embodied divine. Beautiful question. Okay, I didn't read this ahead of time. Actually, the last Ho'oponopono class in Washington, D.C. years ago, he said, just use thank you, I love you, and drop the rest of it. See, exactly. Nothing needs to happen in separation, right? So there it is. There it is. Beautiful. Because why would you go into separation, right? Why would you think that there is something wrong? Why is there anything to apologize for? Just thank you. I love this. Is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Gary. Okay. If you haven't already subscribed, I invite you to click the button and subscribe in the description below. Even on the live stream on every platform, there's an opportunity to subscribe to the YouTube channel. I'm so grateful we're connected in this way. I thought it'd be a quick video. It's quick in the sense that we're going to end in just under an hour. Not so quick in the sense it may have been shorter, but hopefully this more complete exploration of confusion and consciousness has offered you something meaningful. And if the video is resonating with you, please do give it a thumbs up. I'm so grateful we're connected in this way. Please do comment. If you disagree with everything I'm saying, comment. If you agree with what I'm saying, comment. Let's explore. Let's engage. Let's take spirituality out of a dark closet where certain things make sense and other things don't make sense. And let's begin exploring and diving in deeper. And I'll look forward to being back with you for a live stream. Once again, this coming up Wednesday will be in transmission, as we are every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. A little snippet, a tidbit for Spiritual Messengers on Friday, and every Monday, part of this series, Frequently Asked Spiritual Questions. Today, we've been exploring confusion about consciousness, and in particular, victim consciousness. Until we're together again very soon. Peace. Bye for now.